Okay, everybody, welcome to the Q&A webinar for May for 101 Mix Tricks. Thanks for being here. There's a lot of really great questions. I see Dan already has one. Dan, I think you've asked this before. I'm going to address it, or something similar. I'm going to address it pretty soon in the questions that I have on the slides here. So if you're here, get in on the chat. Just let me know. And if you have any questions, type them in on the chat and I'll be sure to get to them. Okay, here's the first one. And this is from Dan. And of course, a lot of these questions come from different places. Either they come from the comments section on the individual mixing tricks. They may come from the forum section, and they may come from emails that people have sent me. And I'm not sure what everybody sees, so that's why I'm repeating some of these here. And if you're on the webinar, you might have already gotten the answer, but I'm going to repeat it again for everybody else that hasn't. So here's one from Dan, and this is regarding mixing trick number 15. And Dan asks, when you use parallel compression on an individual track, you were saying you usually have the parallel at about 50% and the original at 50%. When leveling them together, do you use the meters to make both channels about even? Well, yeah, that's one way, but honestly, the way you kind of do it is just by ear. You bring up the compression track, the parallel compression, until it really sounds good to you, until it sounds bigger, until you get the punch that you're looking for. And then at that point, you just leave it. And usually it's about 50%, but it might be less, it might be 40, it might be 30%. Again, it's wherever you begin to hear it and it sounds right. Of course, if you go beyond 50%, then you kind of defeat the purpose. Usually what you want is more of the original track than the compression track, or at least equal, because that gives you the nice combination of punch and transient response. So that's kind of the reason for the parallel compression to begin with. Okay, let's see what the next one is. This is from Mark, and it's a long question. We're trying to reconcile the following two things. Okay, you guys can't see it on your screen yet. This is coming up. You guys are about 15 seconds behind me. So I bring a screen up and you'll see it about 15 seconds later. And I'm actually looking to see, okay, here it is. I'm trying to reconcile the following two things. I read a lot about engineers being very careful about the positioning of a pair of overhead mics over the drum kit so that both the kick and the snare are at the center of the stereo image. This implies an upside down equilateral triangle with the apex at the snare, the kick, and the overheads at the extremes of the base of the triangle. However, this seems to fly in the face of the 3-to-1 rule to avoid phase problems with multiple mics, because both overheads are exactly the same distance from the kick and the snare. So it seems to me that if you get your tape measure out and set the overheads up equidistant from the snare and the kick, you're going to break the 3-to-1 rule and hence have phase problems with your overheads. Is there a way through this apparent conundrum? Okay, we're talking about tracking here, and you have to understand that there's two ways to set up your overheads. The first way is you're setting the overheads up so they're capturing the sound of the entire kit. And usually this calls for a really big, wide stereo image, which is why people use stereo mics, or they'll use an XY pattern or ORTF pattern above the drums, or just about anything you can think of. And what that means is when you build your mix, you're building it mostly from the overhead. So you bring the overheads up, it gives you the basic sound, and then you bring the individual drums up to fill everything in. That's really good, and it gives you a very natural sound, but it really depends on the room because you have to get the mics up high. And if you get them up high enough, you usually won't have that problem with the 3-to-1 ratio. Uh, Now, the problem with getting them up high enough is the fact that sometimes you have a low ceiling, so it won't work. Because if you get it up near the ceiling, there's a splash and you get some phase problems, phase incoherences, and it doesn't sound that good. And maybe you have a bad sounding room, so that doesn't help you either. So the second way to do it, and sometimes you want to do it this way anyway because of just the way it sounds, is you mic the cymbals instead, and you get close to the cymbals on each side. And you'll find that if you're trying to get rid of leakage, that's kind of the best way to do it. So in that case, each of the individual drums kind of stand on their own, and then the cymbals are brought up on their own as well. Now they all interact still, but you're getting less of the overall drum picture from your overheads. So to answer your question, Mark, what ends up happening here is if you get the mics up high enough, you don't have to worry so much about the 3-to-1 rule. And the other thing is, usually the mics are out at the edges of the drum kit. So in other words, where the far cymbal hits on each side is where you're going to put it. So many times you're not going to have that problem. Now, the ultimate rule here is if it sounds good, it is good, and not to worry so much about getting your tape measure out. I know a few people that do that. I don't know many, but hey, there's a lot of people that do it and get really great results. Most of the people that I learned from, and I still see today, put the mics up and move them until it sounds good, and they don't worry about the 3-to-1 rule. So I suggest that, maybe you start from a place that always works well, but then what you have to do is make sure that it sounds good first and worry about that rather than the 3-to-1 rule. So I hope that helps, Mark. Let's go to the next one here. And this one has to do with, it's another one from Dan. And this is a question that, no, actually, that's not the one he asked. This question from Dan says, I know you've answered this question before, but I'm still not 100% clear on this. What's the difference between pushing the gain up on a compressor going into a limiter on the master as opposed to increasing the input on the limiter itself? I think this is for mixing trick number 14, the hot and loud mix trick, where what we're doing is using two processors. We're using a compressor into a limiter. And generally speaking, you're going to get more gain, get the majority of your gain to make the track louder from the compressor. Now, why don't you want to do it from the input of the limiter? Well, you can, but one of the problems is you tend to lower the threshold when you do that, so it could go into limiting before you want. That's not saying it's going to happen, but in order to avoid that, usually you'll get it more from the compressor than from the limiter. And this kind of goes back to the hardware days, where that's what most of the mastering engineers would do. They would never touch their limiters. They would set it so they knew it wouldn't overload. They knew it wouldn't go to 0 dB full scale. It would just go up to 0.1 dB. And they would never touch it afterwards. And all the gain, everything else would come from the compressor. So this is kind of a remnant of that. But that being said, if your gain staging isn't working well, the best thing you can do is actually use the input to raise your gain, because that will actually help somewhat. So let's go to another question here. Oh, let me clarify that. It will actually help lower the distortion. as long as your gain stage between all of your processors are working pretty well. Here's another question. This is from Jean-Luc. And Jean-Luc asks, hi, Bobby. Could we use a delay time formula to time the decay of the reverb? I noticed that 800 milliseconds decay time is a little bit less than 930 milliseconds, which would match with the half note. Well, it would be nice if you could do that. But one of the problems is that all reverb algorithms are different. And as a result, what ends up happening is what works on one reverb algorithm won't work on another one. And the other thing is also you don't necessarily get a linear fade at different times. So again, what works at one particular decay time doesn't work with another. So to answer your question, no, you can't use that. You really have to use your ears, and the best way to do that is just hit the snare drum or solo the snare drum and listen to where the reverb just dies out for the. In other words, if the reverb is longer than the next snare hit, then it's a little too long. Then you shorten it up. So what you're trying to do is make it just as long as the hole is between the snare hits. And usually that sounds the best, although there may be some times when that won't work and you might just want it longer. So again, it depends on the song and it depends on the arrangement and it depends on so much. But as a starting point, you just try to fill up that hole, and that's the way you do it. But again, you have to do it by ear. So that's the big thing here. Let's go to the next question. And you guys aren't seeing this yet, but you will soon. It's from Anthony. And again, this is another one about the hot and loud mix trick, popular one this month. I use a tape emulation plugin after my bus compressor. I'm big on gain staging, so my question is, is it okay to get the level from the tape plugin instead of the compressor? Yeah, it is. There's not a problem where you're getting it from. The big thing is to just make sure your gain staging is correct. Now, when I say gain staging, what I mean is that you don't have one particular plugin turned up more than all the others. The output isn't way, way, way loud. And the input isn't way, way, way loud. Basically, you want them all about the same. And that way what ends up happening is you'll have the least amount of distortion and the least amount of noise. Now you might want distortion, so you might want to overload or push one harder. And this is kind of the case with the tape emulation. Sometimes you want to push that harder because that's the sound that you want. It's going to give you more glue. It's going to give you more tape sound. So that's what you're going to do. Okay, we just lost something here. Hang in with me. Some reason the screen share just died. There we go. It's coming back up in a second. So anyway, the tape emulation, you can use it, you can get your gain from it, that's okay. Watch your gain staging like anything else, and it should work fine. I'm going to go to the next one here. Once again, you should be seeing this pretty soon on your screen. Here we go. And you're going to see this in a few seconds, but this is about number 84, from Eddie. Question from Eddie. I figured out this on my own a few weeks ago when I was trying to get a fatter snare sound, but the character from the overheads was dominating its sound. It's exciting to see confirmation that it wasn't a goofy idea. Yeah, here's the whole thing. You can get a great snare sound by itself, but it's going to change as soon as you put the toms and overheads in, and the hi-hat too. They all leak together, they all interact. So Again, it's best if you think as a drum kit as one instrument rather than as individual instruments. Usually, sometimes it doesn't work, but usually this is what you want to do. You want to make them, the drum kit sound like one instrument. And it's one of the bad things about gating is if you were to gate the toms or mute the toms, except for when they hit, the character of the snare drum would change. Maybe for the better, maybe not. But just keep in mind that whenever you bring your overheads up, it's definitely going to change that sound on the snare. Usually it will sound better, it will sound fuller. Usually. That doesn't mean it'll be right for the song, so sometimes you won't want to do that. But anyway, yes, it's going to get fatter when you bring those other drums in. And yes, you're absolutely right, Eddie. Okay, we're on to a new one here. This is about number 84, the magic micro panning trick. You're going to see it on your screen in a second. And it says, I see here that a lot of tracks that I would originally thought to be in mono are stereo tracks, and the way you change the stereo range is creating space and direction in the mix. Using this method, then, would you consider it a good practice to work mostly in stereo? And actually, this is something, Dan, I confused you with Gerardo here. Dan just asked before. He said, I've heard a lot of mixing engineers talk about converting their stereo tracks to mono when they mix. They say working with mono tracks makes the mix sound much more focused and clean. What are your thoughts on this? So this is basically the same question asked in a different way. Okay, to Gerardo first. If you record all of your tracks in stereo, and they're recorded well in stereo, then yes, you should use those tracks in your mix. If you're using a lot of tracks that are pseudo stereo, then no, you're better off with mono tracks. Now, pseudo stereo means something that you're getting from a keyboard mostly. So it's a stereo keyboard, but you'll find that one track is dry and the other is affected. And usually it's some sort of crappy effect. And if that's the case, you're better off to throw away the crappy effect and just take the mono, clean keyboard sound. And the reason why is, first of all, yes, as Dan asked, it will be more focused, but you'll also be able to add a better effect, a better stereo effect than usually what you get out of the keyboard anyway. So when it comes to mono and stereo tracks, it's rare that you're going to get, all your instruments in stereo. It just doesn't work that way because nobody records that much in stereo. Drums, of course, acoustic piano, of course, strings are usually done in stereo. You might do some, I rarely hear guitars and things like that unless there's two amplifiers and you'll do it in stereo. And of course, if that's the case, then usually you want to keep that. But again, don't be afraid to throw a track away if you think it's going to help the mix. Now, a way to keep your focus is to have a very tight spread. So in other words, the spread is only 10 degrees or something. Let's say it's from 1 to 2 o'clock. And that will still give you a lot of focus and still have a place in the mix and still give you the depth that you're getting. So, or the depth that you want in the mix. So I hope that helps. I'm thinking about it here. Let me give you guys a poll. And I asked this last time if you were on the last one, the last webcast. But it'd be nice if you can tell me which module you found most useful. I was kind of surprised at the poll last time. So let me know. I have another one a little bit later for you as well. So let's go to the next question. Here's another one from Dan. Dan, you ask a lot of questions, but I like them. They're really good. And I think this is something you asked, it was in a comment on one of the, I think it might have been number 14. It might have been the hot and loud mix trick. And you guys are going to see this come up in a second here. Really enjoying watching all your videos. I have a question about clipping your A to D converters if you have a high quality one. I just wanted your thoughts on this. I've heard that mastering engineers will do this instead of the limiting. Well, are you, Dan, since you're on the webinar, I think you mean D to A converter. And if you can just clarify that, I'm going to assume you meant D to A rather than A to D. Here's the way this works. All D to A converters are not created equally. And all of them actually show overload. In other words, overload LED will come on at slightly different levels. So in other words, if you get a really high quality D to A converter, you may not see an overload at all. But when you play it back on anything else, play it back on your home stereo, play it back on anything else, or even play it back in iTunes, you may see an overload. A lot of it has to do with the fact that the metering isn't as good. A lot of it has to do with, in fact, it is overloading sometimes because there's something called intersample distortion that's happening. And really good D to A converters take that into account and stop it from happening, but really crappy ones don't. And that's a good reason why sometimes you don't really want to crush your audio and put it up at 0.001% limited. So, you know, it's just barely going to overload. Now, there's another way to look at this. A lot of modern mastering engineers don't care anymore. I'm kind of shocked at this, but they don't care if it goes into overload. And the reason why is their clients want it that way. They just want it as loud as possible. They don't care if it's clipping anymore. They don't care about the quality. And chances are it's already come in to a mastering engineer where it's clipped to that depth anyway. So there's no point in fighting it at that point, you know, for mastering engineers. They basically say, hey, I'll give you what I want, what you want. It's not what I want to do. It's not what I recommend, but if that's what you want, that's what I'm going to do. So that happens a lot anymore. What I would recommend is always play it on the safe side. Try to keep your D to A's from overloading. Even if you can't hear it, chances are you won't until you go into severe overloading. What I would suggest is, you know, being very cautious, do it at -0.1 or -0.2. I actually, if I do something akin to mastering at home, or if I put out a client mix, I'll do it at -0.2. And the reason why is if you make an MP3, it actually comes out a little hotter. So if that's the case, then it'll usually be, you know, at 0.1 or something like that. As a matter of fact, I may even back the level off to -0.1 just to be sure that it's not going to clip. And not many people can hear the difference anyway, so it won't matter. The other thing is, if I give it to my mastering engineer, he'll, you know, goose it up there anyway. But should you worry about it? Yes. I mean, if you really want high quality stuff and what you're doing is recorded pristinely well, of course. But you're probably not going to be crushing it anyway, if that's the case. So we live in a sorry world these days where these things mean less and less. But nonetheless, you know, whatever works for you is the best thing I can say. All right, here's one coming up, a new question that's from Aaron. And you guys should see this pretty soon. And Aaron has 3 questions by the looks of things. In order to properly judge the low-end balance, headphones, no matter how nice, are not able to physically move enough air to represent the low frequency information accurately, and checking through the monitors is best. Is this correct? Well, Aaron, yeah, it's not that headphones won't move enough air. It's not a question of moving air. It's more of a question of hearing the low end accurately. And because the drivers are so close to your ears, you're just not hearing it like the rest of the world is going to be hearing it. So that's one of the problems. And I know a lot of people have tried to mix on headphones. Most people can't. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's really easy to make things sound great on headphones, and it doesn't necessarily translate very well to the rest of the world. So that's why people still continue to use monitors rather than listening through headphones. Now, you can get used to anything, and if you do it enough, you can make it work. So if you're forced to work through headphones, after a while, you're going to make sure it's going to work if you compare it to enough of other material. But again, it's a question of ear fatigue. It's very easy to crank your phones up to where you get ear fatigue, and you'll find you'll be being able to work less. So instead of the 6 or 8 hours that you should be able to work, it might be down to 2 or 3 because you're just cranking them so loud. So that's another problem. Okay, I hope I answered that question, Aaron. Here's another one. And he says, do you think the near-field monitors such as Equator D5s or any near-field monitors would move enough air to accurately represent low-end frequencies and balance? I use the Equator D5s myself. I use them for my small monitor, and I really love them. That being said, no, they don't have low end, and no speaker with an 8-inch driver is going to have low end, and many loudspeakers with, I'm sorry, I say 8-inch, no speaker with the 5-inch driver, 4-inch driver is going to have enough low end that you can really tell what's happening below 100 cycles. Likewise, the same thing even with an 8-inch woofer. You're just not going to hear enough on the low end, generally speaking. Now, again, the way around this is, first of all, turn the level up loud enough that you're at least hearing whatever frequencies the speaker can offer. You're hearing them. You're hearing them balanced. The other thing is continue to listen to other hits as a comparison. Just put some other CDs on that you think sound great. Listen to the low end and compare it. And usually you'll find that at least you'll get in the ballpark. Now, what I find is when I get to mastering, I'm usually surprised one way or the other. Occasionally not, but usually I either have too much on the deep low end or I don't have enough. And the mastering engineer then does his thing, and then it works just fine. I'm not the only one. I mean, it happens to a lot of mixing engineers. So undoubtedly it's going to happen to you as well. Occasionally you hit it just right. And a lot of people are really good. They know their speakers so well, and they've done it for so long. They pretty much nail it every time. But the rest of us humans, the rest of us human mixing engineers, we really don't. Sometimes we don't get that 100 and below, 80 and below, 60 and below. We just don't kind of get it right because you can't hear it well in the first place. Okay, number 3 from Aaron. I trust Osinski's approach to EQ areas based on different instruments. Example, for a 22-inch kick, roll off 12 dB at around 30 to 40 and boost it 80 to 100. Remove the hollowness between 2 and 400 and add point somewhere between 3 and 5K. Okay, so instead of reducing the boost levels of certain EQ points, it may be best to lower the fader instead. Is this correct? I'm not sure I understand this. If you mean to lower the EQ and use subtractive equalization. Um, yeah, that's always a good way to do it. If you can find a way to do that, you can find a way that it works really well for me. You're comfortable with subtractive EQ and you can do it quickly. It's definitely the way to go. It's usually always going to sound better. Most people don't do that. Doesn't mean that it's better or worse. It's just that sometimes you can go faster by saying, well, I can just add a dB here or 2 dB there and it'll work. Rather than keep on looking to actually decrease, attenuate a lot more frequencies. So if that's what you mean, yeah, if you can do it, that's a great way to do it. It's usually faster the other way, but it doesn't mean it's the only way. If you mean changing the fader level instead of boosting, sometimes that's a better way to do it. And this happens with the bass a lot of times, where people will goose the low end of the bass guitar, even the kick drum, to make it louder, when really what they should be doing is just increasing the level. So that's something you should keep in mind. Next time you don't feel like you have enough low end or enough bass or enough kick drum, just raise the level first and see if that helps the problem, because sometimes it will. All right, I hope I answered that question, Aaron. I'm not exactly sure what you wanted there, but hopefully we answered it. Now I'm going to open up the floor for any questions. If anybody has any questions, type it in there and I'll be happy to get to it. And the other thing that we can probably do is open up the floor. If somebody wants to ask me a question specifically, I think I can make it do that. The other thing I'm going to do. Oh, okay, here's one from Dan. When mixing and mastering, is the goal to have the EQ curve close to a pink noise curve as possible? No. The goal is to make it sound great. And you can get into trouble by trying to follow a particular curve. It's not even a good idea when tuning a room. I know a lot of room tuners that they never use a pink noise curve. Matter of fact, they use different curves for different types of music a lot of times, where they'll boost at different places, they'll cut at different places for different types. But no, I would never use or try to get close to a specific curve. It's using your ears. It's trying to make something sound really good. What does really good mean? All the frequencies are represented. All of the instruments are well represented. You hear every note distinctly. There's no holes in the frequency response, and there's no big boost in the frequency response. And that's a really good mix. Plus, it has a lot of space, and you can feel a depth to it. So that's just a quick way of describing that. Okay, anybody else have any questions? Let me see if I can. You know what? I have another poll for you, if everybody can see this. And that's kind of tricks, new tricks would you like to see? It's funny because I'm not seeing the polls, so I'm wondering if you guys are. I'm logged in also as you guys are as an attendee. I didn't see the poll come up, which I'm not sure why. But you should be seeing it. Oh, here's why. Okay, you have to say start poll. So there we go. Here's the poll. What kind of new tricks would you guys like to see? Once again, if you have any questions, please ask them right now. Let me tell you a couple things that are coming up. One is there's a lot of plugins that I really like, that I think you guys would like as well. And these are plugins that I use all the time that are boutique plugins. And what I'm going to try to do is get some special deals from the manufacturers and pass them on to everybody. So that's coming in the next few weeks, where in fact you'll be able to see or you'll be able to get some really good deals on some great plugins. Give you some examples. Some from PSP, for instance, which I love. Some from Exponential Audio, which make great reverbs, lexicon style reverbs. And that's just a couple. The other thing is I have a lot of new bonus tricks coming up. And actually, I was going to post one today, and I ran into a bad technical problem because I had upgraded the operating system of my computer and wasn't able to do a screen cap. So that actually held everything up. But I think you're going to start to see a number of really interesting additional bonus tricks that I'm going to post in the next few weeks. Okay, we got a couple more questions. A lot more questions. That's great. Here's from Dan. When mixing it, oh, I answered that already. When using parallel compression, when you make a copy of the channel, you also copy the effects. Yes. Most of the time. Now, I do it for convenience. I may not use all the effects, but I'll copy them just in case I will. It's easier to turn them off than it is to actually have to insert them again. So I'll just make a direct copy. I'll especially make a direct copy with compressors and EQs and stuff because I may want to keep those. Once again, it might be the kind of thing where it'll work great with the existing effects and compression processing. And sometimes you might not want them, but at least it's easier to turn them off than it is to go back and reinsert again. And also you have exactly the same settings. So yes, that's what I would do. But that's just me. Some people might rather do it another way, start from scratch. But for me, that's what I prefer to do. Here's one from Jason. On a subjective note, within the professional arena, are there different views as to what sounds great? Is there a sort of standard that professionals get familiar with? Good question. No, there's no standard. And I'll give you an example. Listen to a bunch of songs on Spotify back to back, a bunch of hits. Listen to them from different eras. Or actually, you can listen to them just, current hits, doesn't matter. Listen to them back to back. And listen to how different they sound. And you'll hear some are really dense. You'll hear some are really open. You'll hear some have a different low end. Sometimes it's big, sometimes it's small. And it kind of works that whatever works for the song works. It may not be the norm, but it works. So you can't really think of a standard. You have to think of, well, this sound, this works really good for the song. And of course, you get it as close to whatever is your reference point as you can, but you're never going to match it exactly anyway. So there comes a point in time where you say, wow, this sounds really good. I don't want to touch it anymore. I got as close as I can. I'm done. Or else you run out of time and it just says you're done. But again, if you kind of miss it with not enough low end, too much low end, whatever, or a bigger bass, a smaller bass, whatever it might be, or more clarity or less clarity, it really doesn't matter. If enough people like the song, it won't matter in the end, unfortunately. So is there a standard? Well, I'll tell you one thing I have found, though, that's kind of interesting, and it flies in the face of everything that we know about modern audio and all the processing that we do. if we go to a hi-fi, or even go to an AES show or an AM show or something like that, where there's a lot of speakers to listen to and there's speaker manufacturers playing things back. The songs that they'll use as demonstration vehicles will usually have a lot of dynamic range. So you'll hear things that are very open and aren't really dense, have a lot of dynamic range and aren't squashed a lot. And a lot of us really think, wow, that sounds great, that sounds really good. But that's not how a lot of modern music is done. We squash it because we have to, because the public demands it, because they're used to it, because our competitors do that, because that's what's on the radio. So there's that balance there. If you ask most mastering engineers, they'd rather not squash things, but they're kind of forced to because that's the sound that producers and artists are looking for. So we're all in this conundrum here where we have to do what we're asked, what the artists ask, what the public demands, and sometimes it might not be in the best interest of the song, but it's something we're forced to do anyway. So is there a standard? Answer your question. No. What I would do is what I suggest to you and what I've done, I have 4 or 5 songs that I always listen to that I really like the sound of, and I always listen to all those and kind of make a comparison. And they all sound different, that's the whole thing. So listen to some Steely Dan tracks, for instance, and there's no low end, or Earth, Wind, and Fire, things like that. You'll notice there's no low end at all, which is kind of interesting. But again, just as a balance and how they all hang together, that's kind of what you're looking for. And there's another one here. What are your thoughts on using parallel compression on the entire mix as a whole? Yeah, I mean, you can do that. And an easy way to do it is you just get a stereo processor that has a balance control where you can balance between the source and the processed audio. So that's a very easy way to do it. Other people do it where they'll do it in sections. And I've heard this a lot, especially, and this goes back to the days when people are using SSLs in their mixing, because there were 3 master groups. And what they do is they put different compression on the master groups. So, and use it as parallel compression. So they might bus everything to the master group and also to the stereo bus, like all the drums, for instance, and then all the rest of the instruments, and then all the vocals to the 3 master groups that are really compressed, and then bring those up. And that was, you know, a trick from way back when. And of course, you can do that as well. It's whatever works, Dan. So I hate to be so vague on this, but certainly if it sounds good, it is good. And I bet it'll sound good. Oh, what I would do, just to make it easy, I'd get a processor that had you know, a balance control, balance between the source and the processing, and use that. Anybody else have any questions here? I'm really happy to. You know what? Let me also do something. I have another poll. Let's see if I can bring it up here. No, I don't actually. I think that's kind of it for now. So if there's no other questions, thanks for being on the webinar today. Thanks for being a 101 Mixing Tricks member. I hope you're enjoying the tricks. I hope you're getting a lot out of them. Answer or ask any questions that you might. Save them for the next Q&A, or make a comment, because I always look every day, or go in the forum, and any of those things, I'm happy to help, or even just send me an email directly, and I'm happy to help you anytime. So, thanks, Dan. Thanks, Jason. I appreciate you being on. So thank you guys, and I will see you next time. About a month from now, we'll do it again.